A millionaire falls in love with a humble woman and decides to change her life. During the wedding preparations, secrets from her past come to light. A devastating fire at the ceremony threatens to destroy everything they've built. Now they must uncover betrayals and face challenges to rewrite their story. The rhythmic hum of the sewing machine echoed through the small atelier as Eleanor guided the fabric with millimeter precision. Her hands, calloused from years of working with needles and thread, moved with the grace of a ballerina. Outside, the sun set over the city of Portsmouth, painting the sky with shades of orange that reflected on the waters of the harbour. It was 1989, and the contrast between the massive cargo ships and the old buildings of the historic centre created a unique landscape where past and present blended like patches of a well-sewn quilt. Eleanor lifted her eyes from the dress she was finishing, a special order for the debutante ball of a loyal client's daughter, and allowed herself a moment of contemplation through the fogged window of her small workspace. At 25, Eleanor carried in her deep brown eyes the characteristic sparkle of dreamers. She had learned the craft from her mother, Mrs. Margaret, who had raised 3 children alone through her sewing work. Now, with her own atelier, a modest room in the townhouse where she lived with her family, she was beginning to build her reputation among the city's most demanding clients. "Eleanor, dear," Mrs. Margaret's voice came through the half-open door, interrupting her thoughts. "There's a lady from the elite here to see you. She says it's urgent." With a sigh, Eleanor adjusted her dark, wavy hair, which stubbornly escaped from her makeshift bun. It wasn't common to receive clients at that hour, especially from the local high society. She smoothed her simple dress and walked to the living room, where her mother was serving coffee to an elegantly dressed woman. "Good afternoon," Eleanor greeted, immediately noticing the visitor's proud demeanor. "I'm Eleanor Portsmouth. How may I help you?" "I'm Victoria Whitman," the woman introduced herself, her tone carrying that peculiar characteristic of the old Brazilian aristocracy. "I need your services for a very special project. My niece is getting married in 3 months, and I've heard you work miracles with fabric." Eleanor felt her heart race. The Whitmans were one of the most traditional and influential families in the region, owners of one of the largest business conglomerates in the country. A job for them could open doors she had never imagined possible. "I would be honored to help," Eleanor replied, maintaining her composure despite her inner excitement. "Shall we schedule a meeting with the bride to discuss the details?" Victoria smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Actually, my dear, I would like you to come to the Whitman mansion tomorrow morning. We need total discretion for this project. Besides the bride's dress, we will require several other pieces for the event." As they discussed the initial details, Eleanor could not have imagined that this seemingly casual invitation would be the first thread of a complex web that would change her life forever. The next morning, as she passed through the imposing gates of the Whitman mansion, located in the most prestigious part of Greenwich, she would be introduced not only to a new world of luxury and privilege, but also to the man who would turn her world upside down. Richard Whitman, the only son of matriarch Regina Whitman, was destined to take over the family business. Tall, with piercing green eyes and a smile that melted hearts, he was known as a workaholic and for his dedication to the family's affairs. That morning, against all odds, their paths would cross in a way neither of them could have foreseen. Fate, like a skilled seamstress, began to weave its invisible threads, bringing together lives that seemed destined to remain in separate worlds. Eleanor, in her simplicity and talent, and Richard, in his world of privilege and responsibility, were about to discover that sometimes love has the power to redraw the most rigid patterns established by society. That night, after confirming the appointment and carefully storing the card with the mansion's address, Eleanor lay awake in her bed, imagining what it would be like to work for such an important family. Her fingers, so familiar with the path between needles and fabrics, trembled slightly with the anxiety of anticipation. Little did she know that she was about to embark on the greatest adventure of her life, where every stitch in her work would also be a stitch in the destiny that awaited her. The morning dawned radiant over Portsmouth, with a gentle breeze from the sea making the palm trees along the beach avenue sway softly. Eleanor got off the bus 2 blocks before the Whitman mansion, wanting to walk a bit to calm her nerves. She carried her work bag, which held all her essential sewing materials for measurements and her sketchbook. The Whitman mansion was even more impressive up close, a neoclassical-style palace with meticulously maintained gardens and a marble fountain at the entrance. The butler, a grey-haired man named Vincent, greeted Eleanor with a formality that made her feel even more out of place. "Please wait in the living room," instructed Vincent, leading her through a hallway decorated with paintings that seemed to cost more than the entire block where she lived. "Mrs. Victoria will be here shortly." Eleanor sat on the edge of a green, velvet sofa, trying to take up as little space as possible. Her eyes wandered over the details of the decor when the sound of hurried footsteps caught her attention. It wasn't Victoria who entered the room, but a young man wearing an impeccably tailored suit, speaking on the phone with visible irritation. "I don't care what the union is saying, Paul. That terminal needs to be operational by the end of the month," he said, pacing back and forth without noticing Eleanor's presence. "Schedule a meeting with them for—" That's when he finally saw her and abruptly stopped in his tracks. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat as those piercing green eyes stared at her with an unsettling intensity. Richard Whitman, she recognized him from the photos in the local newspapers, seemed equally surprised by her presence. "Paul, I'll need to return this call," he said quickly, hanging up the phone without waiting for a response. "Forgive me, I didn't know we had a visitor. I'm Richard Whitman." "Eleanor Portsmouth," she replied, standing up and extending her hand in what she hoped was a professional gesture. "Your Aunt Victoria called me to—" "Ah, you must be the seamstress," he interrupted, a smile lighting up his face. "My mother hasn't stopped talking about my cousin Beatrice's wedding dress. In fact, I think she's more involved in the preparations than the bride herself." The remark, delivered with a slightly ironic tone, made Eleanor smile. There was something about Richard's relaxed demeanor that contrasted with the formality of the setting. "Richard!" The authoritative voice of Regina Whitman cut through the air like a razor. The family matriarch appeared at the doorway, her gaze quickly assessing the scene before her. "I didn't know you had already arrived. I thought you'd be at the port all morning." "Mother," Richard greeted, his tone shifting subtly. "The meeting with the operators was cancelled. I took the opportunity to take care of some pending matters at the office here." Regina turned her attention to Eleanor, who felt an involuntary shiver under the scrutiny of that gaze. "So, you're the young woman Victoria recommended. I hope you understand the importance of this work, my dear. The Whitmans have a reputation to uphold." "Certainly, ma'am," Eleanor replied, maintaining her composure. "I will do my best to meet expectations." "Richard, darling, why don't you go to the office? I'm sure there are more important matters waiting for you than sewing." Regina's tone made her opinion about her son's presence there clear, but before Richard could respond, Victoria entered the room, bringing with her a young woman whom Eleanor assumed was Beatrice, the bride. The girl's face lit up when she saw Eleanor. "You must be the seamstress. I can't wait to start on the dress," exclaimed Beatrice, her genuine excitement easing some of the tension in the room. Richard took advantage of the commotion to say his goodbyes, but not without casting one last glance at Eleanor. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Miss Portsmouth. I hope we meet again." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush slightly, but maintained her professional demeanor. As she followed Victoria and Beatrice to the room where they would take measurements, she couldn't help but notice the disapproving look Regina Whitman directed her way. That first, seemingly casual meeting had planted the seeds of a story no one in that room could have foreseen. Throughout the measuring session and the discussion about the dress details, Eleanor couldn't get Richard's smile out of her mind, nor the way his eyes seemed to see beyond the simple seamstress she was. But she also couldn't ignore the clear message in Regina Whitman's eyes. People like her didn't belong in that world. The following weeks transformed Eleanor's routine. Her visits to the Whitman mansion for Beatrice's wedding dress fittings became increasingly frequent, and with them, the seemingly casual encounters with Richard. He always seemed to be around when she arrived, whether coincidentally having coffee in the living room or urgently needing something in the room next to the fitting area. One particularly busy afternoon, as Eleanor adjusted the hem of Beatrice's dress, the conversation flowed naturally between the two. The bride had turned out to be different from what Eleanor had initially imagined. She was sweet and unaffected, despite her privileged upbringing. "You know, Eleanor," said Beatrice, watching the seamstress's meticulous work through the mirror, "I've never seen a dress take shape like this before. Your hands seem to have magic." Eleanor smiled, focused on her work. "It's just practice and love for what I do. Every dress tells a different story." "And what story do you think this one is telling?" Beatrice asked with a mischievous smile. Before Eleanor could respond, Richard appeared at the door, as was becoming a habit. "Beatrice, your mother is looking for you. Something about the wedding flowers." Beatrice rolled her eyes but smiled. "Of course, another emergency." "Eleanor, can we continue tomorrow? Mum is impossible with these preparations." After helping Beatrice carefully remove the dress, Eleanor found herself alone with Richard for the first time. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. "You always show up at the most challenging moments," Eleanor commented, trying to keep her tone casual as she organized her materials. Richard stepped closer, picking up one of the measuring tapes that had fallen. "Maybe I'm interested in learning about sewing," he replied with a smile that made Eleanor's heart race. "Right," she laughed, taking the tape he handed her. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending an electric current through her skin. "And what have you learned so far?" "I've learned that there's an incredible seamstress who has turned my house into the most interesting place in the world," he answered, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn. "Mr. Whitman." "Richard," he corrected her gently. "Please. And before you come up with an excuse to leave, I'd like to invite you for coffee. There's a lovely pastry shop in the historic center." "I don't think that's appropriate," Eleanor replied, though her heart protested against every word. "Why not?" "Because you're a seamstress and I'm a Whitman," he asked, a hint of frustration in his voice. "Eleanor, I've spent the last few weeks trying to gather the courage to make this invitation. Please don't let social prejudices keep us from getting to know each other better." At that moment, footsteps in the hallway made them quickly step apart. Regina Whitman appeared at the door, her sharp gaze assessing the scene. "Richard, darling, George Mendez is in the office. That matter about the new terminal," she said, her melodious voice barely concealing an implicit order. "Of course, Mother, I'm on my way," Richard replied, but before leaving he turned to Eleanor. "Think about what I said. Tomorrow at 4, the pastry shop is called Sea Blossom." Regina waited for her son to leave before turning to Eleanor. "Darling, you're an excellent seamstress. It would be a shame if something interfered with your work here. Beatrice is so pleased with the dress." The veiled threat did not go unnoticed. Eleanor felt a knot in her stomach, but maintained her professional composure. "Don't worry, Mrs. Whitman. My work is my priority." "Great," Regina smiled, that smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Because, you know, in this field, recommendations are everything. A word from me can open or close many doors." After Regina left, Eleanor allowed herself a moment to take a deep breath. Her mind was a whirlwind. Richard's invitation, Regina's threat, her own treacherous heart that wouldn't stop racing at the thought of the proposed meeting. That night, in her small room, Eleanor spent hours staring at the ceiling, thinking about how her life had changed so much in such a short time. Richard's face, with his gentle smile and determined eyes, wouldn't leave her mind. She knew that accepting that invitation could change everything: her work, her reputation, her life. But something inside her, something greater than fear and caution, had already made the decision. Tomorrow, at 4 o'clock, she would be at the Sea Blossom Bakery. Because sometimes, Eleanor realized, you have to take risks for dreams to become reality. And for the first time in her life, she was willing to risk everything for something her heart told her was true. The Sea Blossom Bakery was one of those places that held the history of Portsmouth in every detail. Located in a 19th century mansion in the historic center, it retained the original mirrors on the walls and the crystal chandeliers that had witnessed decades of meetings and farewells. Eleanor arrived a few minutes before 4, her heart beating unevenly, as she watched the activity through the window decorated with Portuguese sweets. She had chosen a simple yet elegant navy blue dress, which she had sewn herself months ago. Her hair, usually tied up during work, fell in soft waves over her shoulders. With every person who walked through the door, her stomach leaped. "You came," Richard's voice surprised her. He had entered through a side door and was now standing beside her, smiling in that way that made her knees weak. "I confess I thought a lot before coming," Eleanor replied honestly. Richard pulled out a chair for her to sit. "And what made you decide to show up?" "Maybe I'm also interested in learning something new," she replied with a small smile, recalling the excuse he used to show up during the dress fittings. The afternoon passed like a dream. Between cups of coffee and slices of the famous almond cake from the bakery, Eleanor discovered a Richard, different from the businessman she had met at the mansion. He spoke passionately about his desire to modernize the family business, but also about his wish to do something meaningful for the city he loved. "You know, everyone expects me to be just a copy of my father," he confessed, playing with his coffee spoon. "Continuing exactly as it always has been without questioning anything." "And that's not what you want?" Eleanor asked, genuinely interested. "I want to honor my family's legacy, but I also want to create something of my own, make a real difference." His eyes met hers. "Like you do with your dresses. Each one is unique with its own story." The moment was interrupted by a familiar voice. "Richard, what a surprise to find you here." Eleanor felt her blood run cold as she recognized Maurice Tavares, one of the main partners of the Whitmans, accompanied by his wife Amanda. The couple approached the table, their curious glances shifting between Richard and Eleanor. "Maurice, Amanda," Richard greeted, maintaining his composure. "Do you know Eleanor Portsmouth? She's designing Beatrice's wedding dress." "Ah yes, the seamstress," Amanda remarked, her tone wavering between condescension and surprise. "How interesting to find her here." "Eleanor is a talented artist," Richard replied firmly. "In fact, we were discussing some details about the bridesmaids' dresses." Maurice smiled, but there was something calculating in his gaze. Of course, Regina mentioned the exceptional work being done, although she is a bit concerned about some aspects of the wedding." The comment hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Eleanor realized that this casual encounter wouldn't take long to reach Regina Whitman's ears. After the couple said their goodbyes, an uncomfortable silence settled over the table. "I'm sorry about that," Richard began, but Eleanor interrupted him. "You don't need to apologize. I knew what I was getting into by coming here today." She started gathering her bag. "Maybe it's better if I go." "Eleanor, wait." Richard gently placed his hand over hers on the table. "Don't let them affect us. What's happening between us is too real to be destroyed by gossip and prejudice." At that moment, looking into Richard's eyes, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just attraction or a forbidden romance. It was the feeling that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. "You're right," she replied, sitting back down. "But we need to be realistic. My mother will have to accept that I'm not a child anymore. I can make my own decisions." The rest of the afternoon passed too quickly. When they finally left the cafe, the sun was already setting. Over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Richard insisted on walking her to the bus stop, and it was there, with the sound of ships in the background, that he kissed her for the first time. It was a soft, almost shy kiss, but it carried the promise of so much more. When they parted ways, both knew there was no turning back. They were hopelessly in love. What they didn't notice was the discreet flash of a camera across the street. Maurice Tavares, who had coincidentally remained in the vicinity, smiled with satisfaction as he tucked the camera into his briefcase. Those photos would be his guarantee for the future, whether to help Regina break the couple apart or for his own protection against the Whitman family. The day dawned tense at the Whitman mansion. Eleanor sensed it as soon as she crossed the gates for another fitting session for Beatrice's dress. Vincent, the butler, always so formal and proper, could barely look her in the eye as he led her to the fitting room. In the air hung that heavy atmosphere that precedes great storms. Regina Whitman was already waiting for her, seated in a vintage armchair as if it were a throne, her back perfectly straight and an icy smile on her lips. Beside her, Amanda Tavares was flipping disinterestedly through a fashion magazine. "Ah, Eleanor, darling," Regina began, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "How lovely that you're here. We were just talking about you." Eleanor felt her stomach churn, but maintained her professional composure. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitman, Mrs. Tavares. Isn't Beatrice coming for the fitting today?" "Beatrice is feeling unwell," Regina replied, rising with feline grace. "In fact, I thought we could use this moment for a frank conversation. After all, you've almost become part of the family lately, especially after your lovely encounter with Richard yesterday." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Amanda let out a malicious chuckle from behind the magazine. "Mrs. Whitman, No, darling. Let me speak," Regina interrupted, circling the room like a predator closing in on its prey. "Look, I appreciate your talent, truly, but we need to establish some clear boundaries here. Richard has responsibilities, a legacy to uphold. He cannot afford distractions." "With all due respect, ma'am," Eleanor began, gathering all her courage, "I don't believe my personal affairs interfere with my professional work." Regina stopped in front of her, her eyes flashing. "But they do, dear, they already do. Do you know how many phone calls I received this morning? How many of our closest friends have seen you and my son in public? What do you think that does to our reputation?" At that moment, the door opened and Beatrice entered, looking surprised by the scene. "Aunt Regina, what's going on here?" "Nothing serious, dear," Regina replied softly. "Just clarifying a few points with our seamstress. Speaking of which, Eleanor, I think it would be best to reschedule the upcoming fittings. I have some important social engagements for Beatrice in the coming days." It was a clear dismissal. Eleanor began packing her materials, her hands trembling slightly. Beatrice approached, looking genuinely concerned. "Eleanor, wait," she called, but was interrupted by her aunt. "Beatrice, dear, why don't you go see if your mother needs help with the invitations? Eleanor is already on her way out." In the hallway, as she hurried toward the exit, Eleanor nearly collided with Morris Tavares, who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. "Miss Portsmouth," he greeted her with an enigmatic smile. "Leaving so early. I hope it's not bad news." There was something in his tone that made Eleanor shiver. Before she could respond, she heard Richard's voice coming from the office next door. "Eleanor, what are you doing here at this hour?" Regina's face appeared in the doorway of the fitting room. "Richard, darling, I'm glad you're here. We need to discuss some urgent company matters." "Just a moment, Mother," Richard replied, moving closer to Eleanor. But before he could reach her, Maurice intercepted his path. "Richard, the terminal documents need your immediate signature. The investors are waiting." Eleanor took advantage of the distraction to leave quickly. Her heart raced as she crossed the mansion's gardens. It was then that she noticed something strange. Her work bag felt lighter. Upon checking its contents, she discovered that her original sketches for Beatrice's dress had disappeared. That same afternoon, in her small studio, Eleanor received an envelope with no return address. Inside, there was only a card with a typed message. "Too talented to waste your gift on distractions, don't you think? I suggest focusing on what really matters." What Eleanor didn't know was that, at that very moment, Richard was facing his own battle in the mansion's office. Regina had just shown him a folder full of documents that supposedly proved irregularities in the family's business, irregularities that could easily be corrected as long as he reconsidered some of his recent personal choices. The silent war for the hearts of Eleanor and Richard had only just begun, and Regina Whitman had just made her first decisive move. Margaret watched worriedly as Eleanor rummaged through old boxes in the attic of the house. It was almost midnight, but her daughter seemed possessed by a feverish urgency to find something among the family mementos. "Darling, you need to rest," insisted Margaret, holding a cup of tea that Eleanor hadn't even touched. "You can continue searching tomorrow." "I can't, Mom," Eleanor replied, flipping through an old photo album. "Something has been bothering me ever since I started working for the Whitmans. It's like there's a story that isn't being told." It was then that a yellowed envelope fell out of the album. On the front, in the elegant handwriting of her late grandmother, it read, "To be opened only when necessary." "What is this envelope, Mom?" Eleanor asked, noticing how Margaret paled upon recognizing it. "Something your grandmother left," Margaret replied, sitting heavily in an old chair. "She made me promise to only give it to you when it was truly necessary. I think... That moment has come." With trembling hands, Eleanor opened the envelope. Inside there was a letter and some old black and white photographs. Her eyes widened as she recognized a young Regina Whitman next to her grandmother, both smiling in front of an old sewing workshop. "Dear granddaughter," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it's because fate has decided to intertwine the paths of our families once again. A long time ago, Regina Whitman and I weren't just acquaintances, we were friends. Your grandfather had just passed away, leaving me with an immense debt and a workshop on the brink of bankruptcy. It was Regina, then a young society lady, who helped me rebuild the business." Eleanor looked at her mother, who was now silently crying. "Why did you never tell me this?" "Keep reading," Margaret whispered. But Regina changed. The letter continued. "Power and social status transformed her. When I needed her again years later, she not only denied me help, but also used her influence to drive away my most important clients. All because I opposed her methods of running the family business after her husband's departure. She chose power over friendship, and I chose my principles over money." At that moment, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a message from Richard. "We need to talk. It's urgent. Can you meet me at the cafe in the Coffee Museum tomorrow morning?" Eleanor quickly replied yes, as she continued reading her grandmother's letter. The next revelations made her heart ache. Her grandmother had been instrumental in saving the Whitmans' business during a financial crisis in the 70s, using her connections with former clients to secure investors. In return, Regina had promised a partnership that never materialized. "But I hold no grudges, my dear," the letter concluded. "I've learned that true wealth lies in maintaining our integrity. If our paths ever cross with the Whitmans again, remember, the truth, no matter how painful, is always the best path." The next morning, Eleanor arrived early at the Coffee Museum, one of the most imposing buildings in the historic center of Portsmouth. Richard was already waiting for her, looking as though he hadn't slept all night. "We need to be quick," he said as soon as she sat down. "I've discovered something about Maurice Tavares. He's been embezzling money from the company for years, using ghost accounts at the port. My mother knows about it, but she protects him because he holds her secrets." "Richard," Eleanor interrupted, placing the old photographs on the table, "there's something you need to know about our families." As she recounted the story revealed in her grandmother's letter, Richard's face shifted from surprise to indignation. "So that's why," he murmured. "That's why my mother was so upset when she found out about us. It's not just social prejudice, it's fear of the past coming to light." "There's more," Eleanor continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I found this among my grandmother's papers." She slid an old unsigned contract across the table, one that promised 15% of the shares of the Whitman family's company to her grandmother. Richard picked up the document with shaky hands. "Eleanor, this changes everything. If this goes public—" "I don't want to use this," she interrupted firmly. "I didn't come here to blackmail or demand anything. I just think we need to understand what we're up against." At that moment, they noticed Maurice Tavares entering the cafe. He saw them and smiled, that calculated smile that didn't reach his eyes, as he made a call on his cell phone. "We need to be smarter than them," Richard whispered, holding Eleanor's hand on the table. "Together." What they didn't know was that, at that very moment, Regina Whitman was receiving a special package on her desk: the original sketches of Beatrice's dress, along with a note from Maurice suggesting that it might be time to look for a seamstress more suitable for the job. The news struck like lightning on a sunny day. Beatrice had decided to change seamstresses for her wedding dress. The information, delivered through a cold and formal call from Victoria Whitman, hit Eleanor like a physical blow. 3 months of work, hundreds of hours of dedication, thrown away with a single sentence. "They can't do this," protested Margaret, seeing her daughter sitting silently in front of the idle sewing machine. "The contract—" "They're the Whitmans, Mom," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying a calm she didn't feel. "They can do whatever they want. But what no one expected was Beatrice's reaction. That same afternoon, the young bride appeared unannounced at Eleanor's small atelier, her eyes red from crying. "I can't take it anymore," Beatrice blurted out, as soon as Eleanor opened the door. "Aunt Regina is controlling every aspect of my wedding, and now this. You're the only one who understood exactly what I wanted in the dress." Eleanor led Beatrice inside, offering her a glass of water as the young woman continued her outpouring. It was then that Beatrice revealed something surprising. She had accidentally overheard a conversation between her aunt and Maurice Tavares about the real reasons for pushing Eleanor away. "They mentioned something about old documents and a contract," Beatrice explained, her eyes shining with curiosity. "And Maurice said he had photos of you with Richard that could cause a scandal if they leaked to the press." Eleanor felt her heart race. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. "Beatrice," she began cautiously, "how long have your aunt and Maurice been working together?" "Since my uncle passed away," Beatrice replied, furrowing her brow in concentration. "Actually, it was strange. Maurice showed up out of nowhere, as if he already knew all the family secrets. Within a few months, he had become Aunt Regina's right-hand man." At that moment, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a message from Richard. "We need to meet. I've discovered something about Maurice. Bring your grandmother's documents." "Beatrice," Eleanor said, making a sudden decision, "do you trust me?" The young woman nodded without hesitation. "After everything they've done to you?" "Completely." "Then I need your help. Your wedding is in 3 weeks, and I think it's time for some truths to come to light." The next few hours were intense. Eleanor, Richard, and Beatrice discreetly met at a cafe away from the city center. Richard brought with him a folder full of documents that proved the irregularities committed by Maurice in the family business. "He's been embezzling money for years," Richard explained, showing spreadsheets and contracts. "But the most interesting thing is this." He slid an old newspaper clipping across the table, showing Maurice Tavares, 20 years younger, standing next to Regina's late husband. "They knew each other," Beatrice whispered, surprised. "But Aunt Regina always said Maurice was a recommendation from a friend at the bank." "Exactly," Richard confirmed. "And look at the date on this photo. 1 week before my father disappeared. On his business trip." Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine. "Richard, do you think—" "I don't have proof," he interrupted gently. "But I think Maurice knows far more about my father's disappearance than he's ever admitted, and he uses that knowledge to manipulate my mother." Beatrice, who had been listening in silence until then, straightened in her chair. "I want to help," she declared firmly. "My wedding can wait. This is more important." It was then that Eleanor shared her plan. With Beatrice's help, they would gain access to the mansion without raising suspicions. Richard could dig deeper into the office files, while Eleanor had her own mission. "I'll finish your dress," she told Beatrice, "but not at the atelier. We'll work at the mansion where Regina and Maurice can see us. They need to believe they've won, that they control me." "It's risky," Richard warned, holding Eleanor's hand. "Your mother needs to know the truth about Maurice," Eleanor replied with determination. "And about her past with my grandmother. Not for revenge, but because secrets like these destroy families." When they left the coffee shop, each had a clear role in their little plot. What they didn't notice was the solitary figure sitting in the darkest corner of the establishment. Amanda Tavares had heard every word of their conversation, and her face showed the conflict of someone carrying secrets too heavy to bear. Eleanor's return to the Whitman mansion was triumphant, though not in the way Regina had expected. Beatrice had publicly insisted on keeping her original seamstress, arguing that it would be impossible to find someone capable of replicating the work already done on the dress in such a short time. Regina, always concerned with appearances, had no choice but to relent. "But the fittings will take place here at the mansion," she had declared, her tone brooking no argument, "to keep everything under proper supervision." It was exactly what Eleanor had hoped for. Now settled in one of the second-floor rooms transformed into a temporary atelier, she had privileged access to the household's routine. Richard had arranged for her to have a copy of the office key, though they hadn't yet found the perfect opportunity to use it. "She's planning something," Amanda Tavares remarked to her husband, watching Eleanor work through the slightly open door. The girl isn't as naive as we thought. Maurice simply smiled, that smile Amanda had learned to fear over the years. Let her plan. The more she gets involved, the more we'll have to use against her later. What no one knew was that Amanda carried her own burden of guilt. 20 years ago, she had been the secretary to Richard's father, and she held a secret that could change everything. That night, after Maurice had fallen asleep, she secretly met Eleanor in the mansion's garden. "We need to talk," Amanda whispered, her hands trembling as she lit a cigarette. "About what happened to Richard's father." Eleanor felt her heart race. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't take it anymore," Amanda replied, her voice choked. "Maurice isn't who everyone thinks he is. He and Regina, they have an agreement sealed in blood." Before she could continue, they were interrupted by footsteps in the garden. Regina Whitman emerged from the shadows, her face a mask of studied calm. "Amanda, darling, what a surprise to find you here so late." Her voice was honeyed, but her eyes were steel. "And with our seamstress." "I was just checking some details for the bridesmaids' dresses," Eleanor replied quickly, shielding Amanda. "Mrs. Tavares kindly offered to help." Regina arched a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "Such admirable dedication. Amanda, Maurice is looking for you in the office. Something about important documents." After Amanda hurried away, Regina turned her attention to Eleanor. "You know, dear, you remind me so much of your grandmother. She also had that talent for meddling where she wasn't invited." "My grandmother was a woman of integrity," Eleanor replied, keeping her composure. "She trusted people perhaps too much." "Integrity," Regina laughed softly. "A virtue too costly these days, don't you think? Especially when one has so much to lose." At that moment, a noise from the office caught both their attention. Richard was there, apparently working late. Through the lit window, they could see his silhouette bent over the desk, examining documents. "My son is a good man," Regina remarked almost to herself. "Too good for his own good sometimes, like his father." There was something in her voice, regret perhaps, that made Eleanor look at her differently. "Mrs. Whitman, we don't have to be enemies. The past is dead," Regina cut her off sharply, "and I suggest we leave it that way, for everyone's sake." But the past refused to stay buried. That very night, as she packed her things to leave, Eleanor found something unexpected among the folds of her dress. An old photograph apparently placed there by Amanda. The image showed Maurice Tavares, 20 years younger, standing beside Richard's father in a foreign port. On the back, a single handwritten line, "The deal is done. No one will ever know." What Eleanor didn't know was that, in the study, Richard had just discovered something even more unsettling. A set of old letters exchanged between his mother and Maurice, dated before his father's disappearance. The letters suggested a far deeper and more complex relationship than anyone could have imagined. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom of the mansion, Regina Whitman held in her trembling hands a letter never sent to her old friend, Eleanor's grandmother. "Forgive me," the first lines read, "but I had no choice. They threatened to take everything from me, including my son. Some choices haunt us forever." The truth, like a complex patchwork quilt, was beginning to take shape. But crucial pieces of the puzzle were still missing, and time was running out. Beatrice's wedding was approaching, and with it, the moment when all the secrets would have to come to light. The week leading up to Beatrice's wedding turned the Whitman mansion into a minefield of tensions and secrets on the verge of exploding. Eleanor, now putting the finishing touches on the wedding dress, watched the frantic comings and goings of suppliers and decorators, while keeping her senses alert for any information that might help unravel the mystery surrounding the two families. It was during one of these afternoons, while adjusting the embroidery on the sleeve of her dress, that Beatrice made an accidental discovery. When she dropped her bag, an old envelope slipped out from a folder that Eleanor kept among her materials, the letter that Regina had never sent to Eleanor's grandmother. "Eleanor," Beatrice called, her voice trembling slightly as her eyes scanned the handwritten lines. "You need to see this." The full content of the letter was devastating. Regina revealed that she had been blackmailed by Maurice Whitman years ago. He had discovered irregularities in the family business, irregularities committed by Regina's husband, and threatened to expose everything, which would not only ruin the reputation of the Whitmans, but also result in serious legal consequences. "He gave me a choice," Regina had written. "Either I helped him gradually take control of the business, or he would destroy everything my family had built. When you tried to warn me about him, I was already too involved to turn back." "This explains so much," Beatrice whispered, looking at Eleanor with tear-filled eyes. "The way Aunt Regina changed after my uncle disappeared, how she lets Maurice practically control the company." At that moment, the door to the studio opened, and Amanda Whitman hurried in, her face pale with worry. "You need to leave here now," she warned in a low voice. "Maurice found out about your investigations. He's furious." "How did he find out?" Eleanor asked, quickly tucking the letter away. "He has hidden cameras in the office," Amanda revealed. "He saw Richard going through the old files. And now," her voice faltered, "he's threatening to reveal everything about the past, including what really happened to Richard's father." A noise in the hallway made the three women startle. Regina Whitman appeared at the door, her face a mask of composure that barely concealed her agitation. "Amanda, darling, Maurice is looking for you," she said, her tone falsely sweet. "And Beatrice, your mother needs help with the final details of the ceremony." After the two left, Regina closed the door and turned to Eleanor. For the first time, the young seamstress saw something different in the matriarch's eyes, not the usual pride or arrogance, but fear. "You found the letter," Regina stated. It wasn't a question. "Mrs. Whitman," Eleanor began, but was interrupted. "No," Regina raised her hand. "Let me speak while I still have the courage. You need to understand every choice I made, every decision I took, was to protect my son, even if it meant losing the only true friend I ever had." Silent tears began to stream down Regina's always composed face. "Your grandmother tried to warn me about Maurice. She discovered something about him, something terrible. But I was blind, desperate to hold on to the empire my husband built. And now," her voice faltered, "and now Maurice controls everything," Eleanor finished softly. "Not just the business," Regina whispered. "He has evidence that could destroy not only me but also Richard. Documents that show the embezzlement started with my husband, and that I helped cover it all up after he passed." A scream from downstairs interrupted the confession. It was Richard's voice, strained in a way Eleanor had never heard before. The two women rushed to the staircase, only to find a chaotic scene in the entrance hall. Richard held a set of documents in his trembling hands as he confronted Maurice Tavares. "How could you?" he shouted. All this time you knew what happened to my father." Maurice maintained his calculated smile, but his eyes betrayed tension. "Be careful with your accusations, young man. Some truths are too dangerous to come to light." It was then that Amanda Tavares, standing at the top of the stairs, finally found her voice. "Tell them, Maurice. Tell them about the meeting at the port that night, about the deal you made with Richard's father, and about what really happened." Afterward, the smile finally vanished from Maurice's face, replaced by an expression Eleanor would never forget, a mix of anger and fear that transformed his always controlled features into something almost unrecognizable. The silence that followed Amanda's words was as thick as fog on a winter morning. In the hall of the Whitman mansion, time seemed to have frozen as everyone present absorbed the weight of that moment. "Amanda, dear," Maurice finally spoke, his voice now carrying a tone of veiled threat, "I think you're confusing things." "I'm not confusing anything," Amanda replied, descending the steps with a firmness that surprised everyone. "I've spent 20 years carrying this secret, 20 years waking up in the middle of the night, remembering that night at the port." Richard took a step forward, the document still shaking in his hands. "What night at the port? What are you talking about?" "Your father found out," Amanda continued, now directly facing Maurice's gaze. "He found out about the embezzlement, about the fake accounts overseas. He confronted Maurice that night, threatened to expose everything." Regina, who had been silently observing the scene, brought her hands to her mouth. "No, it can't be." "But that was just the tip of the iceberg," Amanda continued. Charles Whitman had discovered something much worse. Maurice wasn't just embezzling money, he was involved in smuggling, using the company's terminals as a front. Enough! Maurice lunged toward his wife, but Richard and Vincent, the butler, held him back. That's why you disappeared with my grandmother's documents, Eleanor realized suddenly. They weren't just about the family business, they were evidence of your scheme at the port. Your grandmother was too clever for her own good, Maurice snarled. Just like Richard's father, always wanting to do the right thing, weren't they? And where did that get them? Where did you take my father that night? Richard demanded, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. It was Regina who answered, her voice almost a whisper. To the ship. The cargo ship that was departing for Singapore. She leaned against the wall, seeming to age years in seconds. Maurice told me they had made a deal, that Charles had accepted an offer to start a new life abroad. I believed it because I wanted to believe. But that's not what happened, is it? Amanda asked, though she already knew the answer. Charles never made it to Singapore. The ship made an unscheduled stop in the open sea, and then he simply wasn't on board anymore. Maurice's face twisted into an expression of fury. You have no proof of any of this. These are just the speculations of a bitter woman. I have the letters, Amanda shot back. The letters you exchanged with the ship's captain. And I have the diary I've kept all these years, recording every detail, every whispered conversation I overheard. Eleanor watched as Maurice's always controlled face began to show cracks in his facade of composure. But it was Beatrice who had quietly returned to the hall, who delivered the final blow. We also have this, she said, holding up a flash drive. All the records of suspicious transactions from the last 20 years. Richard wasn't alone in investigating. I was also searching for answers, and I found much more than I expected, in the old office archives. You don't understand, Maurice tried to argue, now visibly nervous. Everything I did was to protect the company's interests. Charles was an idealist. He was going to destroy everything with his obsession with honesty. And that's why you got rid of him? Richard stepped forward, only held back by Eleanor, who grabbed his arm. You used my mother, manipulated the entire family. Regina knew. Maurice played his final card. She knew everything and chose to stay silent. To protect you, Richard. To protect the empire your father built. Regina stepped forward, and for the first time in years her face showed the determination that had made her the matriarch of the Whitmans. Yes, I knew. And I've carried that burden for 20 years, Maurice. I let you manipulate me, blackmail me, because I believed I was protecting my son. But now, she turned to Richard, tears streaming freely down her face. Now I realize I was betraying him every day by keeping this secret. The sound of sirens in the distance made everyone jump. Amanda held her phone. I've made my choice, she said simply. The police are on their way, and this time I have all the evidence they need. Maurice looked around like a cornered animal. For a moment, it seemed he might try to flee, but Vincent and 2 other household staff had already blocked the exits. 20 years of lies and manipulations were about to crumble, and there was nowhere left to run. The days following Maurice's confession completely transformed the dynamics of the Whitman mansion. With him giving statements to the authorities and all the evidence being investigated, the house seemed to breathe easier, as if a 2-decade weight had finally been lifted from its walls. Regina spent long periods in her room, emerging only for important conversations with Richard or to address urgent company matters. The mask of perfection she had cultivated for so long had shattered, revealing a deeply remorseful woman determined to make amends for her mistakes. On a particularly significant afternoon, she asked to speak with Eleanor in private. The 2 women met in the winter garden, where the scent of orchids softened the tension of the moment. I found this among the old things in the office, Regina said, handing Eleanor a carved wooden box. It belonged to your grandmother. Maurice confiscated it years ago when he began his blackmail. With trembling hands, Eleanor opened the box. Inside, she found dozens of old sketches, some yellowed with age, but still retaining the beauty and delicacy of her grandmother's strokes. They were the original designs of the dresses she had created for the high society of Portsmouth in the 60s and 70s. She was a true artist, Regina remarked, her voice choked with emotion. Not just a seamstress, but a creator of dreams. Like you, Eleanor. Why are you showing me this now? Because it's time to correct the mistakes of the past, Regina replied, sitting down beside Eleanor. Your grandmother wasn't just my seamstress, she was my partner. We had plans to create a haute couture house together. The contracts were ready when... Her voice faltered. When Maurice showed up, Eleanor finished softly. Regina nodded. He found out about the financial troubles my husband was facing. He used that to infiltrate the company, promising magical solutions to our debts. When Charles discovered the truth... She didn't need to finish the sentence. And now, Eleanor asked, delicately flipping through her grandmother's sketches. Now, Regina took a deep breath. I want to do what I should have done 20 years ago. The partnership contract your grandmother signed is still valid. 15% of the shares in Whitman's company are legally yours, Eleanor. The news hit Eleanor like a wave. But that's not necessary. I didn't come here for money or power. I know, Regina smiled sadly. That's exactly why you deserve it. You and Richard, you've shown me that there are things more important than power and social status. You reminded me of the person I used to be, before fear and ambition transformed me. At that moment, Richard appeared in the garden. His eyes still carried the pain of recent revelations, but there was also a new determination in his expression. The investigations are progressing, he informed. Amanda is fully cooperating with the authorities. She kept far more evidence than we imagined. And Beatrice, Eleanor asked, worried about the impact of all this on the upcoming wedding. She decided to postpone the ceremony for a few weeks, Richard replied, sitting beside Eleanor. She said she wants a marriage based on truth and love, not appearances and secrets. Regina stood up, leaving the young couple alone. Before leaving, however, she turned one last time. Eleanor, there's one more thing I need to tell you. About the wedding dress your grandmother was making for me, before everything, before I ruined our friendship. I think it's time for it to finally be worn. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she understood the meaning of those words. Richard held her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. Of course, he smiled. That is, if you agree to marry the son of a family that caused you so much pain. Eleanor looked at her grandmother's sketches. At the ring Richard discreetly slid onto her finger, and at Regina's face in the doorway, 3 generations of stories, pain and love intertwining like the threads of a complex and delicate embroidery. Sometimes, she replied, you have to undo a few stitches to create something even more beautiful. In the office, Amanda finished organizing the last pieces of evidence to be handed over to the authorities. Among the documents, she found an old photo, her first week at the company, standing next to Charles Whitman. In the picture, he smiled with that characteristic kindness that always annoyed Maurice. On the back, in her own shaky handwriting, she had written, "Finally, justice will be served." The Church of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, one of the oldest in Portsmouth, was filled with white flowers on that sunny spring morning. The double wedding of Beatrice and her fiancé, and of Eleanor and Richard, had become the most talked about event in Portsmouth society, not because of the recent scandals, but because of the story of love and redemption it represented. In the small side room of the church, Eleanor admired her reflection in the mirror as Margaret made the final adjustments to the dress. It wasn't just a wedding dress, it was a piece that told the story of 3 generations. The original design had been created by her grandmother for Regina decades ago. Now through Eleanor's hands the dress had come to life, blending the classic design with contemporary touches that reflected her own personality. "Your grandmother would be so proud," Margaret whispered, her eyes glistening as she adjusted the veil. "She's here," Eleanor replied softly, touching the delicate embroidery that replicated the distinctive pattern of her grandmother's work. In every stitch, in every detail. Regina Whitman gently knocked on the door before entering. Over the past few months, since the revelations that had changed everything, she had transformed. The weight of the secrets she had carried for so long had given way to a serenity she hadn't shown in years. "I brought something for you," Regina said, holding out a small blue velvet box. Inside, a pair of antique pearl earrings glimmered softly. "They were your grandmother's. She left them with me on the day I let Maurice come between us. I think it's time they returned to the family." The three women embraced, silent tears sealing a reconciliation that transcended generations. Outside, the guests were already beginning to take their seats in the church. Beatrice, stunning in her own dress, the last great creation of Eleanor before she assumed her role as creative director of the new fashion division at Whitman Enterprises, peeked through the door. "It's time," she announced with a radiant smile. At the altar, Richard waited beside Beatrice's groom. His eyes lit up as he saw Eleanor walking down the aisle. Over the past few months, as they worked together to reorganize the company and establish new governance standards, their love had grown even stronger. Amanda Tavares, seated discreetly in one of the side pews, smiled serenely. After her crucial testimony, she had found her own way to start anew, taking charge of a social project supported by the company, dedicated to helping young sewing talents develop their skills. The judge overseeing Morris's case had agreed to allow his presence at the wedding under police escort, not out of any sympathy for the defendant, but because his final testimony, revealing the full truth about Charles Whitman's disappearance, had earned this small concession. During the ceremony, when the time came for the vows, Eleanor and Richard chose simple yet deeply meaningful words. "Like a precious fabric," Eleanor began, her voice clear and emotional. "Our love has been stitched with threads of truth and courage. Every obstacle we faced only strengthened our bond. Every revelation brought us even closer." "And like a patchwork quilt," Richard continued, holding his bride's hands. "Our story is made of different moments, colors, and textures, but together we form something unique and indivisible." Regina, watching the scene beside Margaret, finally allowed herself to smile genuinely. In her hands, she held a small notebook, the diary of her old friend, Eleanor's grandmother, which she had found among the documents returned by the police. In it, a highlighted phrase seemed to shine: "True love, like the finest stitching, withstands the test of time." The reception that followed, held in the gardens of the Whitman mansion, was not just a celebration of the marriage, but a milestone of transformation. The old house, for so long suffocated by secrets and manipulations, now breathed an air of renewal. At the end of the night, as the last guests said their goodbyes, Eleanor found an envelope on her work table in the studio, now transformed into her official workspace. Inside, an old photo showed her grandmother and Regina, young and smiling, in front of the first studio. On the back, a recent message written by Regina: "True love takes many forms, between families, between friends, between lovers. But its essence is always the same: the ability to forgive, to rebuild, to move forward. Thank you for teaching me that again." Eleanor smiled, placing the photo alongside her grandmother's sketches. Outside, the sun set over the port of Portsmouth, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. The same port that had witnessed so many departures and arrivals over the years now bore witness to a new beginning. Richard embraced her from behind, both of them gazing at the sunset through the studio window. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About how endings can also be beginnings," she replied, intertwining her fingers with his. "And about how love, when true, has the power to mend broken hearts once more."